Welcome to another Detective Agatha Marple mystery, The Unraveling of Lies and Deception, a classic courtroom mystery. If you are new to our channel, please do consider subscribing to us and giving us a like. If you enjoy this thriller courtroom story, and if you are a regular, welcome back. Chapter 1. The Shattered Testimony. A damp, chill evening had settled over 1927 London, its streets wrapped in a swirling embrace of fog and the sputtering glow of gaslights. The night was thick with secrets, and the quiet hum of an ancient city whose cobblestones had borne witness to countless stories of ambition, vice, and redemption. At the heart of this urban tapestry stood the venerable Old Bailey, its austere facade a monument to justice, a justice that, on this night, seemed as murky and elusive as the mist outside. Inside the cavernous courtroom, shadows danced upon the dark wood panelling and marble floors, each surface absorbing the tension that hung in the air like a shroud. The gallery was a restless sea of hushed whispers and furtive glances, its occupants acutely aware that tonight their fates might hinge upon the fragile recollections of a single man. Every murmured speculation and anxious exhale reverberated against the lofty ceilings, imbuing the space with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. At the centre of this charged atmosphere, Arthur Beck, a gaunt, haunted man with a distant gaze, moved with a measured deliberation toward the witness stand. His footsteps echoed softly on the marble, a solitary metronome march toward revelation, or perhaps further obscurity. His presence was a study in contradictions. The pallor of his skin and the tremor in his hands bespoke deep inner torment, yet his eyes, shadowed by a lifetime of unspoken regrets, held the faint glimmer of an unwilling truth. Unbeknownst to the assembled throng, among the silent observers sat one whose calm, shrewd eyes missed nothing. The detective Agatha Marple. Seated unobtrusively in a dark corner of the gallery, her expression was inscrutable, yet every subtle twitch of her lips and every discerning glance betrayed a mind that was both patient and unerringly precise. In that moment, as Arthur Beck's measured steps drew him inexorably closer to the witness stand, Agatha's thoughts were already sifting through the myriad clues of a case that promised to unravel the tangled skein of greed, jealousy, and fear. Outside, the London fog continued its restless waltz with the night, as if in quiet conspiratorial agreement with the secrets contained within the Old Bailey's hallowed halls. Each droplet of mist, each wisp of vapour curling around the gaslit streets, seemed to echo the whispered uncertainties of those within. Uncertainties that only time and the steady hand of a keen observer might eventually dispel. Thus, as the courtroom braced itself for the testimony that was to follow, the stage was set for a drama where appearances would be deceiving and every shadow might conceal a hidden truth. The delicate balance between order and chaos teetered in that moment, leaving every soul present to wonder, in a city defined by its opulent facades and claustrophobic secrets, would the truth finally emerge from the fog? Arthur Beck's trembling footsteps carried him to the witness stand, his every move punctuated by the palpable tension of the grand Old Bailey. The courtroom, with its dark wood panelling and high vaulted ceilings, exuded an austere opulence that belied the claustrophobic pressure the assembled jury and press now felt. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windows, its tendrils echoing the uncertainty that clung to every word spoken within. The judge's gavel had scarcely fallen when Beck began to speak. His voice, tentative and quivering, broke the heavy silence. I remember a shape, a figure," he stuttered, his eyes darting nervously as if searching for solid ground amid his fragmented recollections. "There was a man, a railway worker, I believe, Henry Fletcher, and then a well-dressed gentleman. He was vanishing into the night." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The reporter in the front row scribbled furiously in his notebook, and the jury leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the man whose memory seemed as elusive as the London mist outside. In that charged moment, every heart in the room beat in sync with the slow, uncertain cadence of Beck's testimony. "Mr. Beck," intoned the judge with a measured calm that brooked no nonsense, "could you be more specific about this gentleman's description?" Beck's hand trembled as he clutched the edge of the podium. He wore a fine suit, dark and elegant, more refined than one would expect of someone mingling in these quarters," he replied haltingly. "And his face, I only caught a glimpse, a shadow, disappearing." His voice faltered, the words failing him as the memory receded like a retreating tide. In a shadowed corner of the gallery, Agatha Marple observed every nuance of Beck's performance. Her keen eyes, sharp behind delicate spectacles, noted the conflict in his expression, the interplay of duty and trauma that lent his words an almost hypnotic uncertainty. To her, the details spoke not merely of a simple recollection, but of a deliberate obfuscation, or, perhaps, a mind struggling to reconcile conflicting truth. There was a subtle irony in witnessing a man whose recollections were so fractured, entrusted with the fate of an innocent man's reputation. Across the courtroom, whispered speculations arose. "Henry Fletcher, a modest railway worker, is hardly the sort one would suspect of such involvement," murmured a juror, his tone laced with both sympathy and scepticism. Yet another voice, softer and tinged with curiosity, noted, "And what of the gentleman in the fine suit? Who is he to be seen at the scene of this affair?" The red herrings began their silent dance, each question compounding the mystery rather than clarifying it. Beck's eyes shone with a mixture of fear and resolve as he continued, I believe that I saw them together, if only for a moment. The railway man seemed burdened with a quiet despair, while the other, his features were obscured by the night, yet his bearing suggested a man of considerable means. His words were weighed with unspoken motives. The modesty of Fletcher contrasted starkly with the enigmatic grace of the suited figure. A sharp voice from the counsel's bench broke the fragile silence. "Mr. Beck, are you suggesting that these two men were accomplices?" the prosecutor inquired, his tone edged with the self-assurance of one accustomed to wielding the law as a weapon. "Or are you simply mistaken?" Beck's response was lost in a heavy pause, as if the very atmosphere of the courtroom had conspired to steal his words. Instead, he merely shook his head, his eyes reflecting a desperate attempt to grasp at the elusive truth. I don't know," he whispered, the final syllables barely audible over the ambient rustle of shifting papers and murmured interjections. "My mind... it is as though I'm looking through a fog." In that moment, Agatha Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The fog outside seemed to mirror the labyrinth of human emotions within, a tapestry of greed, jealousy, and fear, woven so intricately that only the keenest observer could hope to unravel its threads. Her dry wit, honed over years of quiet observation, mused silently that memory, like the London fog, often conceals as much as it reveals. The assembled press exchanged furtive glances, aware that Beck's fractured account was less a definitive chronicle than a tantalizing glimpse into a far more convoluted narrative. For all the ambiguity of his testimony, the subtle clues, Henry Fletcher's noted despair, the elusive silhouette of a man who appeared far too refined for his surroundings, had set in motion a series of questions that promised to upend the straightforward assumptions of the case. As Arthur Beck's voice trailed off into a heavy silence, the courtroom held its collective breath. The mysterious interplay of identities and motives had been laid bare, albeit in fragments, inviting every observer to ponder the hidden machinations at work. And in that charged stillness, Agatha Marple's mind raced ahead, piecing together the initial clues with a calm assurance. She knew that beneath the veneer of societal propriety lay secrets waiting to be uncovered, secrets that would eventually unravel the carefully woven fabric of deception surrounding this case. Thus, amid the opulent yet stifling confines of the courtroom, The stage was set. Beck's fractured memory, fragile as glass and equally dangerous, had only deepened the mystery. A mystery that promised to expose the darkest recesses of human ambition and the insidious nature of those who thrive in the shadows of 1920 London. The courtroom, once held in a fragile equilibrium, now seemed to quiver under the weight of silent accusations. As the proceedings resumed, murmurs of "guilty" and "scapegoat" began to ripple through the gallery like a dissonant chorus. The genteel facade of the Old Bailey, with its dark wood panelling and lofty ceilings, could not conceal the palpable shift. A collective judgment preordained before a single incontrovertible fact had been laid bare. Henry Fletcher, the unassuming railway worker, was the unwitting magnet for this tide of prejudice. His modest, time-worn features and simple attire, a threadbare suit that spoke more of honest labour than of genteel refinement, rendered him an easy target. Even as he sat in a secluded row, his presence alone seemed to summon a well-dressed gentleman, his tone clipped and patronising, remarked quietly to his companion, "It is almost too convenient, a man of such humble origins entangled in matters that clearly demand a more sophisticated hand." His companion, a slight man whose nervous eyes darted about beneath his meticulously styled hat, replied in a hushed whisper, "Indeed, his background only cements the idea that he is nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. The very essence of his character lacks the gravitas to be taken seriously in this affair." Their words, delivered with an air of detached superiority, floated over the murmuring crowd, affirming the deep-rooted biases of a society too eager to dismiss the common man. Seated at the back of the gallery, Agatha Marple absorbed every subtle nuance of the unfolding drama. Behind her discreet spectacles, her observant eyes missed nothing. She noted the trembling cadence in Arthur Beck's earlier testimony, the slight quaver that hinted at internal conflict rather than clear memory, and the furtive glances exchanged between the prosecution's liars. Their sidelong looks carried more than mere professional courtesy. They whispered of an unspoken agenda, a desire to see the case resolved in a manner that would protect the esteemed traditions of their class. In a brief lull, as a prominent barrister from the prosecution adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, Agatha's mind wandered to the nature of such prejudice. With a dry internal amusement she mused, "The very instruments of justice, polished and pristine, are here to serve as vessels for bias. One might think that in a court so steeped in history and decorum, truth would prevail, but alas, truth is often the first casualty when the scales of justice are tipped by sentiment." Across the room the murmur grew. A lady in an elegant hat whispered to her neighbour, "It is too clear. A man of Fletcher's ilk with his humble origins could scarcely be expected to navigate the treacherous waters of high intrigue without falling prey to misfortune." Her neighbour, equally refined, but with eyes that betrayed a spark of independent thought, merely nodded, as if resigned to the inevitability of the social order. Yet Agatha Marple's seasoned intuition told her that beneath these facile judgments lay far more, a labyrinth of motives, greed, jealousy, fear, all intermingled with the stifling air of class prejudice. She observed how the very atmosphere of the courtroom, replete with opulent ornamentation and claustrophobic intimacy, magnified the collective readiness to condemn each whispered opinion. Each furtive glance was a clue in itself, a subtle marker of the undercurrents that would in time betray the true nature of the crime. Thus, as the gavel of prejudice threatened to seal Henry Fletcher's fate before all the evidence had been fairly weighed, Agatha Marple's mind catalogued these moments with quiet precision. In that charged, hallowed hall, where the echoes of pomp and prejudice mingled with the soft clatter of shifting papers, the seeds of misdirection had been sown. And though the public's eye was fixed upon the lowly railway worker as the easy culprit, the astute detective knew that the truth lay hidden in the very shadows of these whispered assumptions, a truth that, once unveiled, would render the apparent simplicity of guilt all the more deceptive. The office of Agatha Marple was an unassuming space tucked away in the corner of a narrow lamplit lane. Modest by any grand standard, it nonetheless bore the hallmarks of a mind attuned to detail and order. The walls were lined with sturdy oak shelves, each cradling a neat array of leather-bound volumes and carefully labelled files. On a large, well-worn desk sat a scattering of open case notes, a gleaming brass lamp casting a warm glow over her tools of the trade, a fountain pen, a polished magnifying glass, and a stack of ivory-coloured paper. To the side, a typewriter rested patiently, its keys silent for now. Agatha herself occupied the centre of this ordered domain. She sat upright in a high-backed chair, the soft rustle of her tailored suit blending into the gentle ambience of her surroundings. Her hair, streaked with silver and secured in a tidy bun, caught the light as she bent her head over a document. Her spectacles perched lightly on her nose, and her calm, penetrating gaze swept across the court transcripts in her hand. From time to time she would pause, set the papers aside, and reach for her pen. The scratching of its nib against paper seemed to harmonize with the faint ticking of a small carriage clock on the mantel, the room's only other sound. Before her lay not only the cold, clinical words of testimony, but also the map of London that she had carefully annotated. Streets, alleyways, and landmarks were marked with small, precise notations, as if each point might lead her closer to the elusive truth. The dim lamplight seemed to flicker with purpose, illuminating not just the ink on the page, but the steady, methodical thoughts behind her eyes. Here, in this quiet sanctum, Agatha was in her element. The questions posed in court, the fragmented recollections of Arthur Beck, and the troubling whispers of guilt hanging over Henry Fletcher, each fact, rumour, and assumption found its place on her desk. She did not hurry. Instead, she allowed her mind to sift through the layers, letting the night air from the half-opened window carry away distraction. It was in these silent hours, with no one to observe her but the shadows cast by the gaslight outside, that Agatha Marple performed her best work. Each clue she found, each inconsistency, each fleeting detail that others had overlooked, was weighed carefully. She made no immediate judgment, but filed away each tidbit of information, trusting that in time the disparate threads would weave themselves into a tapestry she alone could decipher. And as the city beyond her window murmured softly in its sleep, she continued to work, calm and unrelenting, preparing for the revelations that tomorrow's light would bring. Agatha Marple arrived at Henry Fletcher's home just as the last rays of daylight surrendered to the London fog. The small terraced house stood on a narrow street, its modest brickwork damp from the evening mist. The windows glowed faintly with warm light, but the atmosphere inside was one of muted anxiety. Henry's wife, a slim woman with a kind yet careworn face, greeted her at the door and ushered her into the parlour. Henry Fletcher's high-flown and blush-in hair, a symbol so brilliant in the morning that several windows had looked as though the horizon was glass. The room was humble and neat, with threadbare drapes framing a small, smudged window. A well-worn armchair and a small sofa crowded the space, their faded upholstery bearing the marks of long use. A gas heater flickered in the corner, casting shadows across the modest collection of knick-knacks on the mantel. A china dog, a tin soldier, and a small clock that ticked steadily. The Fletcher children sat quietly on the sofa, their eyes wide and watchful. Their mother, Mrs. Fletcher, smoothed her apron nervously as Agatha settled into the armchair. "We don't know how it came to this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Henry's a good man. He's never been in trouble, never. He's worked on the railway for near 20 years. Everyone at the depot would tell you he's honest as the day is long." Agatha folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm and encouraging. "Tell me a little more about Henry," she said gently. "The more I understand, the better I can help." Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward the fireplace, where a faded portrait of the family rested on the mantel. It showed a younger Henry, his face broad and kind, his arm around his wife and their infant son in his lap. "He's always been a family man," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "Emma's to Sunday dinner, and he always made sure the children had shoes on their feet and warm coats in winter. He'd pick up extra shifts if need be, but he never complained. It's not in his nature." Her son, now about 10, chimed in quietly. "Dad was teaching me how to fix things. Locks, clocks, little engines. He said I had to learn to do things right, that there's a right way and a wrong way." The boy's voice was solemn, and Agatha noted the pride in it. "Thank you, that's helpful," Agatha said. Her eyes shifted to the corner of the room, where a pair of boots stood neatly by the door. Their soles worn but clean. She made a mental note of their size and the scuffed leather, as if they held a story of their own. She then turned to Mrs. Fletcher again. "And on the night in question, do you recall anything unusual? Any callers, any messages, any change in Henry's demeanour?" The woman shook her head. "No, nothing. He came home at his usual time, had his tea, played with the children a bit, then said he was going to take a short walk before bed. That was all. When he didn't come back, well, I thought maybe he'd run into someone and got to talking. That's not uncommon. But then they came to our door, saying he'd been found at that awful place." Her voice broke slightly, and she dabbed her eyes with her apron. Agatha allowed a moment of silence before speaking again. "Did he mention anything out of the ordinary at work recently? Any disputes or changes?" "None that I can recall," Mrs. Fletcher said, her brow furrowing in thought. "But now that I think of it, he did say something about a man he didn't quite trust. Someone new at the depot, but he never went into detail. I didn't press him at the time." "Someone new," Agatha repeated thoughtfully. "And you don't know his name?" Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. Henry wasn't one to bring his work troubles home. He tried to keep that separate, for the children's sake." Agatha nodded, her gaze drifting to the small table by the window, where an old tin of tobacco sat. Next to it lay a small pocket-knife, its blade folded in, and a handkerchief embroidered with an initial. The room itself seemed to hum with quiet, honest dignity, a life lived modestly and steadily until the outside world, with all its complexities, had rudely intruded. "I appreciate you sharing this with me," Agatha said as she rose to her feet. "It helps to understand the man behind the accusations. Thank you for your time." Mrs. Fletcher, standing as well, gripped Agatha's hand. "Please, Miss Marple, find the truth. Henry doesn't belong in that place. He doesn't deserve what's happening to him." Agatha gave a reassuring smile. "I will do my best, Mrs. Fletcher." She glanced once more around the room before making her way to the door. As she stepped out into the cold night air, the faint light from the parlour fell across her back. For a moment she paused, adjusting her scarf against the chill, and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The pieces were beginning to gather, even if they didn't yet fit, and somewhere within the small, humble home of Henry Fletcher lay a truth that would point her toward the threads she needed to unravel the mystery. Between the soot-grackened bricks and the drifting fog that clung like a ghost's breath to East London's narrow streets, the city's undercurrent of whispers came alive. It was here, not in the marble halls or neatly trimmed avenues, that one might catch the threads of rumour and half-hidden truths, provided one knew how to listen. Agatha Marple, modest and unassuming in her dark woolen coat, moved as easily through these alleys as she did through the genteel drawing-rooms of the West End, her sharp mind attuned to the subtle shifts in tone that often revealed more than the words themselves. At the corner of a shadowy lane, a pub's back door creaked open. Warm light spilled into the fog for a fleeting moment before the door closed again, and Agatha stepped silently into the smoke-filled tea-room above it. The air here was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and damp wool, and the murmur of conversation was low, intimate. She settled at a corner table, her tea steaming in its chipped saucer, and let the currents of talk wash over her. "They say it was done deliberate, you know," muttered a man at the next table, his words barely audible above the hum of conversation. He leaned closer to his companion, who was swaddled in an overcoat too fine for the dim surroundings. "Tampered with it like, to point the blame elsewhere. Agatha adjusted her spectacles and turned her attention to her tea, her face betraying nothing. The second man spoke then, his voice smooth, his accent faintly clipped. What sort of tampering? Not that it matters, really. Those at the top always find a way to bury the truth, don't they? Sure, but it was a proper nobleman involved, the first man continued, his voice dropping further. High up, you know, them what don't take the stand themselves, but they've got hands everywhere. He gestured vaguely, the movement of his fingers visible through the haze of pipe smoke. They say he's done it before, turned things to his advantage. Always comes out smelling of roses, don't he? The companion leaned back in his chair and chuckled softly, a sound that was more knowing than amused. That's the trouble with men like him. Too much polish, not enough conscience. Still, a dangerous one to cross. Agatha allowed her gaze to drift out the window. Beyond the frost-laced panes, the alley stretched into obscurity, the faint gaslight at the corner casting weak pools of gold on the wet cobblestones. Her mind lingered on the conversation behind her, weighing each word. A nobleman tampering with evidence? How plausible it seemed, and yet how easy it was for such rumours to grow in the telling. She let the notion rest for a moment, like a seed planted in rich soil, before turning her thoughts to the broader picture. If there was truth in these whispers, it suggested a motive more intricate than simple malice or greed, the involvement of someone at the highest social echelon, someone with the means to manipulate proceedings, pointed to a web of connections that could only be untangled by careful, quiet steps. Agatha drained her cup, then folded her gloved hands on the table. The tea-room continued to murmur around her, the haze of smoke curling toward the ceiling, and yet her mind was already elsewhere. The faint trace of intrigue, so casually dropped by two men who would never guess they'd been overheard, had set her on a path that promised not only the potential for redemption, but the unraveling of deeper, more sinister motives. She would have to tread carefully, to draw out the truth from the layers of deception that cloaked it, but that was her way, to move quietly, steadily, through even the murkiest of waters until the light of understanding broke through. She rose at last, gathering her coat around her and stepping into the alley once more. The fog welcomed her back, and with it came the reassuring realization that the pieces were slowly falling into place. Hidden motives, high society corruption, and carefully planted clues, these would come together in time. For now she would let the whispers guide her, and trust that the truth would reveal itself to those who knew how to listen. A week had passed since the trial began, and Arthur Beck's nights were still haunted. He had taken refuge in a small, dimly lit room at a local charity shelter. The modest quarters, though a respite from the cold streets of London, offered little comfort. Shadows danced across the cracked plaster walls as a candle flickered in the corner, its weak light barely penetrating the gloom. The city was quiet, but only a few ghosts talked within. Outside, the sound of muffled traffic blended with the occasional foghorn from the Thames, a city alive with secrets. Beck sat up suddenly, sweat beading on his brow. The nightmare had been vivid, almost too vivid. In his mind, he saw the gilded corridors of Sir Edmund Carlyle's residence. He hadn't set foot in such a place before, but the details were unmistakable. Ornate moulding, polished mahogany doors, and walls adorned with solemn portraits of long-dead ancestors. Beck's breath quickened as the fragmented images in his mind began to coalesce. Through the haze of memory a figure emerged, Lord Rupert Blackwood, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture elegant yet imposing. Beck saw him slipping through the dim corridor, his footsteps eerily silent on the plush runner. There was something about Blackwood's manner that unnerved him. The man moved with purpose, his face betraying nothing, yet his very presence seemed to distort the air around him. Beck's heart pounded as the scene played out in his mind's eye. Blackwood pausing near a door, his hand briefly lingering on the gilded handle before he disappeared into the shadows. Beck gripped the edge of his thin blanket, his fingers trembling. "Blackwood," he whispered to himself, as though saying the name aloud might banish it. But the vision lingered, bringing with it a swell of doubt and dread. He recalled Henry Fletcher's presence that night, too. His hunched posture, the quiet despair in his eyes. Henry had looked out of place, uncomfortable, as if he had stumbled into a world that would sooner swallow him than acknowledge him. But Blackwood belonged there. He was a man who didn't just fit into that setting, he shaped it, commanded it. As Beck clutched his battered hat, the memory sharpened further. The nobleman's face came into focus, his sharply angled features, the slight smirk that suggested secrets known but unspoken. A chill ran through Beck's body, the kind of chill that came not from the night air, but from the realization that the story he had been telling himself might be wrong. This wasn't a simple case of guilt, pinned on the most convenient scapegoat. This was something more insidious, more deliberate. He stared at the candle's trembling flame, trying to steady his own thoughts. The image of Blackwood lingered. He had heard of the man before. His name whispered in tea-rooms and back alleys, always in the context of power quietly exercised. A gentleman whose refined manners cloaked ambitions few dared to guess at. Beck's pulse raced as he considered what it might mean to remember Blackwood in that corridor. The memory wasn't just a flicker, it was a warning. Chapter 2. Shadows of Contradiction. The townhouse of Lord Rupert Blackwood stood in sharp contrast to the shadowed streets and humble cottages Agatha had wandered earlier that day. Its facade, a vision of Georgian symmetry and pristine stonework, rose above the stately Mayfair Square. Gaslight flickered against the polished brass fixtures at the door, casting a warm glow on the meticulously swept steps. Agatha, unhurried, let her eyes wander over the building's immaculate lines, before finally knocking. Her gloved hand met the heavy knocker with a single deliberate rap, its sound dissipating into the chilled evening air. The man who answered, Blackwood's valet, was every inch the professional servant. His posture was stiff, his manner polite, his gaze sharp. Dressed impeccably in a black tailcoat and starched collar, he ushered Agatha into a grand wood-panelled entry hall. The air inside was faintly perfumed with beeswax polish and the faint lingering aroma of aged brandy. "Lord Blackwood is not receiving visitors at the moment, madame," the valet said, his voice clipped and neutral. "Indeed," replied Agatha, her tone mild. "I'm here on a rather pressing matter, and I would appreciate a moment of your time." He inclined his head slightly, but did not move to lead her farther in. "What matter would that be, madame?" Agatha held his gaze, noting the subtle shift in his stance. "Just enough to suggest discomfort. I have reason to believe Lord Blackwood might have knowledge that could assist in clearing an innocent man's name. I'm afraid his lordship's engagements prevent—" "I imagine his lordship's engagements are rather flexible, given that he has taken such a pointed interest in this case," she said quietly, watching his reaction closely. The valet's face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly. "Madam, I assure you that Lord Blackwood has been quite involved in certain dealings that raise a number of questions," she finished, her voice calm and measured. "Tell me, did he return late on the night in question, or did he, perhaps, not return at all?" The valet's eyes flickered, the briefest sign of hesitation. "His lordship returned home promptly after his engagement." "I see," Agatha said, allowing the pause to lengthen. "And he used this set of keys?" Her gaze shifted to a side table where an extra set of keys rested. "It seems prudent for someone to carry a spare, doesn't it? Especially if one might misplace the first." "That set," he replied briskly, "is for the staff entrance. His lordship, of course, would not use—" Agatha raised her eyebrows. "Oh, fortunate that all keys lead to the same place. Tell me, when was the last time his lordship entered by the staff door?" The valet faltered, just for an instant, before regaining his composure. "Madam, I'm afraid I can be of no further help. If you would like to leave a message—" "No, thank you." Agatha straightened her coat and gave a small, polite smile. "You've been most illuminating." As she was shown out, the grand hall seemed more sombre than splendid. The valet's answers had been careful, but not careful enough. Agatha's mind tucked away the inconsistencies, an extra set of keys, the sudden shift in his demeanour, the almost reflexive dismissal of certain questions. The elegant surroundings had their charm, but charm alone wouldn't hide the truth. She stepped back out into the crisp London night, her breath visible in the cool air, and continued on her way. Later that evening, Agatha found herself in a very different setting. The library of Lady Evelyn Carlyle was a room steeped in the quiet elegance of a bygone era. Tall, book-lined shelves framed the space, their volumes bound in cracked leather and faded gilt. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and lavender furniture polish. A fire burned low in the grate, casting a soft glow across a room that seemed to hum with the weight of history. Lady Evelyn herself was a figure of contrasting grace and disillusionment. Once the pride of the Carlyle name, she now carried herself with a certain wariness that came from years of disappointment. Her gown, though finely tailored, was modestly cut, her jewellery understated. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, her words chosen with care. She regarded Agatha with a faint smile, more melancholy than welcoming. "I understand you have questions about my late cousin," she began, gesturing for Agatha to sit by the fire. "I'm not sure what I can add, but I'll do my best to help." "Any insight is valuable, Lady Evelyn," Agatha replied, settling into the offered chair. "I'm especially interested in Sir Edmund's dealings before his death. I understand he was preparing to expose certain improprieties?" Evelyn's lips tightened. She looked away for a moment, her eyes resting on a framed portrait of a younger Sir Edmund. "Yes, he was determined to bring certain unpleasant truths to light. It's why he insisted on keeping those correspondences, despite my warnings." "Correspondences?" Agatha prompted gently. With a sigh, Evelyn reached for a small bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. She handed them to Agatha, her hands trembling slightly. "These." He had gathered evidence of financial misconduct among several prominent families, names that would shock polite society. Lord Blackwood's was among them. Agatha unwrapped the ribbon carefully, her eyes scanning the neatly penned letters and ledger entries. The language was subtle, the details buried in polite phrasing and coded references, but the implications were unmistakable. Blackwood had been involved in dealings that, if revealed, could have ruined him, and possibly others. "He never spoke of it openly," Evelyn said softly. "But he was afraid of what would happen if those who stood to lose the most discovered what he intended to do." "And you?" Agatha asked. "Were you afraid?" Evelyn's expression hardened, though her voice remained steady. "I was afraid for him, for his safety. I urged him to let it go, but he wouldn't, and now he's gone." She closed her eyes briefly, regaining her composure. "I can't bring him back, but if these papers can help someone else, I won't stand in their way." Agatha rose, clutching the bundle. "Your courage will not go unnoticed, Lady Evelyn." Evelyn gave her a faint smile, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Just do what must be done, Miss Marple. It's more than I could manage." Agatha nodded and stepped out into the cool hallway, the quiet of the library still wrapped around her. The papers in her hand carried the weight of a man's final effort to expose a dangerous truth. As she made her way into the darkened streets of London, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The shadows of contradiction were growing sharper, and with them the path forward became clearer. The rain had slackened, but the cobblestones remained slick, reflecting the wavering glow of gas lamps overhead. Agatha Marple walked slowly, her footsteps measured as she moved through the wet streets. The sharp smell of damp brick and rain-soaked pavement mingled with the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. Around her, London's constant hum persisted, the distant clatter of a hansom cab, the occasional bark of a tradesman's call, the faint echo of a pub door swinging open to spill laughter into the fog. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. The evening's revelations had pulled together a series of threads that now wove a pattern too elaborate to dismiss. The flash of Arthur Beck's memory, Blackwood's shadowy presence in that corridor, had introduced the first strand. That recollection, however fractured, had lent weight to a question that refused to leave her. Why would a man of Blackwood's standing appear so near the scene of Sir Edmund's death, only to vanish as quietly as he arrived? Then there was the valet's carefully constructed evasiveness. Agatha's lips pressed together in a slight frown. Valets were trained to provide seamless alibis. After all, their livelihood depended on discretion, yet this one had slipped, however slightly. The keys, the hesitations, the faint tightening of his jaw when pressed, these were not the behaviours of a man recounting an ordinary evening. And now Lady Evelyn's documents. The weight of those papers, even as they rested in her handbag, felt heavier than their mere physical presence. The correspondences, the coded entries, the insinuations of financial impropriety, all pointed to a scandal that would devastate those involved. Blackwood's name, prominently entwined in the ledgers and letters, wasn't simply a whisper in the dark. It was a glaring beacon. To the casual observer, these revelations might appear circumstantial. To Agatha, they were the corner pieces of a puzzle slowly revealing its shape. Her steps slowed as she reached a narrow lane between two rows of terraced houses. The alley, shadowed and still, seemed a world apart from the opulence of Mayfair and the cramped quarters of the East End. Here the two worlds collided. The gentry might hide their misdeeds behind mahogany doors, but the ripples of those actions inevitably spilled over into the lives of those below. It was in these quiet, unassuming streets that Agatha felt the weight of her task most keenly. The innocent caught in the web of someone else's deceit had no voice to clear their name, save perhaps hers. A faint wind stirred, lifting the edge of her scarf. Agatha stopped and turned her face toward the faintly glowing horizon where the city never truly slept. The shadow of Blackwood's involvement now loomed large, darkening every thread of evidence she'd gathered so far. But even shadows could deceive, she reminded herself. They shifted with the light, grew or shrank with the observer's position. It was not enough to suspect. One must be certain. She resumed her walk, this time with a firmer step. The puzzle was not yet complete, but the pattern was becoming clearer. And somewhere in that intricate web of motives and lies, Agatha Marple would find the truth. Chapter 3. Beneath the Veil of Deceit. The park was nearly deserted in the early dawn, its rain-slicked paths glistening faintly under the hesitant light of the waking sun. Arthur Beck sat hunched on a weathered bench beneath a sprawling chestnut tree. The air was cold and damp, and the thin coat he wore offered little protection against the drizzle. In his hands was a chipped enamel cup, filled with lukewarm tea that he barely tasted. He stared ahead, his eyes unfocused, as the city around him began to stir. The distant hum of delivery carts and the occasional clatter of a milkman's bottles were the only signs of life in the misty stillness. It was then, with no warning, that the memory struck him, sharp and vivid like the sudden slash of a blade. He was no longer in the park. In his mind's eye he was back in that grand shadowed hallway, the gilded walls lit by flickering sconces. The heavy scent of beeswax and faded roses lingered in the air. He could see Lord Rupert Blackwood standing there, his tall frame poised with a quiet deliberation. Blackwood's gloved hand moved smoothly, almost languidly, as he slipped a small piece of folded paper into Henry Fletcher's work-bag. The document, a letter perhaps, had the unmistakable air of importance, its neat folds and creamy paper stark against the rough canvas bag. Beck's breath caught in his throat. The clarity of the image was startling. It was not something he had imagined, it was a moment he had witnessed. The sharp lines of Blackwood's features, the faintly amused set of his lips, the polished ease with which he performed this damning act. It was all seared into his memory now, clear as day. And yet, in the chaos that had followed, that image had slipped from him, buried beneath the fog of confusion and fear. Until now, he clutched the cup tightly, his knuckles white, and let the rain patter against his coat. The realization settled over him like the chill of the morning air. What he had seen that night was not merely an event. It was the deliberate, calculated act of a man determined to shift blame. And he, Arthur Beck, had stood by, his mind too fractured to recognize the gravity of it all. Until now. Beck rose from the bench unsteadily, the tea forgotten, the chill no longer noticeable. Each step home felt heavier than the last, as if the truth weighed down his very bones. The streets, still damp from the morning rain, blurred around him as he walked. His mind raced, filled with a torrent of images and emotions. He saw again the look on Blackwood's face, calm, unhurried, and utterly without remorse. He saw Henry Fletcher's confused expression as the accusations began to mount. He felt the crushing guilt of his own silence, the silent consent he had given by saying nothing. Inside his modest lodgings the air was stale, the walls close and confining. Beck stood by the window, staring out at the rooftops shining faintly under the clearing sky. The city carried on, its people rushing toward another day, unaware of the weight he now carried. His mind roiled with conflict. To speak out meant more than admitting what he had seen. It meant stepping forward into the light and naming one of London's most respected nobles as a liar and a manipulator. It meant exposing himself, his frailties, his flaws, and the fear that had kept him silent for so long. But even as doubt gnawed at him, a voice deep within grew stronger. He had seen what he had seen. The memory was not a dream or a fabrication, it was a fact. And if he remained silent now, if he allowed that damning document to carry an innocent man to ruin, he would be complicit. He would be no better than Blackwood, no better than the others who stood by while lives were shattered for the sake of convenience or pride. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, Arthur Beck made his decision. He would tell the truth. No matter the cost, no matter the repercussions, he would not remain silent. The shadowy world of aristocratic deceit would not claim him as another pawn. He would speak, and in doing so, he would expose the rot beneath the polished veneer. In that quiet moment, the rain-washed city outside his window seemed almost peaceful. Beck took a deep breath, steadying himself. The path ahead would be difficult, and the outcome uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of resolve, an anchor to hold on to in the storm. The truth, heavy as it was, would no longer remain hidden. The rain had ceased hours ago, yet the air still hung heavy with its aftermath. Agatha Marple stood at the edge of the alley, the hem of her sensible coat brushing the glistening cobblestones. The night was starless and cold, the kind of darkness that muffled sound and blurred even the brightest lights. Only a solitary street lamp threw its faint glow, its weak radiance reflecting off the puddles scattered along the narrow lane. From a distance came the faint clamour of London's ceaseless rhythm, hooves on pavement, the muffled laughter from a public house, the occasional shout of a cabman. But here, within these confined walls, silence reigned. Footsteps broke that silence, faint at first, then louder as they approached. Lord Rupert Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the damp stones. He paused just beyond the circle of light. His tall frame stooped slightly, as though the weight of his own presence in such a setting caused him discomfort. His face, usually composed and refined, was lined with tension. It was not fear, exactly, but something close, the grim anticipation of a man who knew he was about to cross a boundary he could never return from. Agatha regarded him with calm detachment, her hands neatly folded in front of her. She said nothing, letting the oppressive quiet speak for itself. When Blackwood finally stepped into the faint glow of the street lamp, she noted the small details, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cuffs, the tightness at the corners of his mouth. These were not the gestures of a confident man. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the night, "I didn't think you'd stoop to summoning me in such a venue." Agatha's lips twitched in something resembling a smile. "I find that truth often prefers dark corners, Lord Blackwood. It has an aversion to drawing-rooms and drawing-room manners." His mouth opened as if to deliver a retort, but he thought better of it. Instead, he took another step closer, his polished exterior cracking ever so slightly. "I don't see what you hope to gain from this charade," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I have told you everything you need to know." "Have you?" Agatha's tone was mild, her gaze steady. "I rather think you've told me precisely what you wanted me to know. Now let's try again. What really happened that night?" Blackwood hesitated. The tension in the alley grew taut as wire. The dim light played across his sharp features, revealing the subtle creases of a man who had spent weeks living with a gnawing secret. At last he drew a shaky breath and stepped closer. "You wouldn't understand," he began, his voice trembling despite his attempt to steady it. "You think it's all so black and white, but it's not. It never is." Agatha said nothing, her calm gaze compelling him to continue. Blackwood ran a hand through his carefully combed hair, a gesture that appeared out of place and strangely desperate. "I was desperate," he said finally, his words little more than a whisper. "You don't know what Sir Edmund was threatening to do. He had the documents, the letters, the figures. All of it. He was going to ruin us. Not just me, all of us." "Us?" Agatha asked softly. Blackwood's eyes flicked toward her, then away again. He looked as though he were weighing the value of truth against the cost of speaking it. Finally he sagged, his proud shoulders drooping under the weight of his guilt. "Yes," he said, his voice almost inaudible. "All of us. The families who built everything you see around you. The foundations of our world." He laughed bitterly. That's what he called it, the foundations. "But they're not so solid, you see. One crack and everything crumbles. Edmund knew that, and he was going to tear it all apart." His words tumbled out now, unbidden, as if some internal dam had finally burst. "I couldn't let him do it. I had no choice. If those papers had come to light, it would have been ruin, not just for me, but for everyone who mattered. So I did what I had to do." "And what precisely did you do, Lord Blackwood?" Agatha's tone remained even, her voice steady against the torrent of his confession. "I planted the letter," he said, his voice trembling. "The one that led them to Fletcher. It wasn't enough to stop Edmund, but it was enough to buy time. I hoped, that if I could make it seem as if someone else had—" He trailed off, his words failing him. Agatha regarded him in silence for a long moment. The distant clamour of the city seemed to grow louder, as if London itself were listening. Blackwood's confession, halting and incomplete, was a thread she would follow to its end. She had no need to rush him. The weight of his guilt was already drawing out the truth, inch by inch. "You see now," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't greed, not entirely. It was desperation. Surely you understand that?" Agatha met his gaze, her expression inscrutable. "I understand, Lord Blackwood. The question is, what will you do about it now?" His lips parted, but no answer came. The truth, it seemed, was as heavy as the darkness that surrounded them. As the first drops of a renewed drizzle began to fall, Rupert Blackwood stepped back, the street lamp's feeble light catching the sheen of dampness on his temple. The strength that had bolstered his composure now slipped away, leaving only a man exposed. The manicured elegance of his life, the perfectly knotted cravats, the practised smile at galas and fundraisers, those, too, dissolved under the weight of the truth he had carried for far too long. "I thought I could control it," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I thought that if I moved quickly, decisively, I could keep the secret safe and keep the rest of us untouched. But—" He hesitated, his hand twitching at his side. "It's like trying to stop water from seeping through a cracked wall. One patch, then another. The cracks spread, the pressure builds, and before long—" His words trailed off, lost to the growing patter of rain on cobblestones. Agatha Marple watched him with the same calm intensity she had shown since the conversation began. She said nothing, allowing the silence to fill the space between them, urging him to continue. "I thought it would be simple," Blackwood went on, his voice unsteady. "A forged letter, a convenient suspect. It wouldn't have come to this if only Sir Edmund had seen reason, but then Edmund was gone and Fletcher became necessary. If he took the blame, if the trail ended with him—" Blackwood shook his head, the words crumbling under their own weight. He turned toward Agatha fully now, his aristocratic bearing stripped bare. You've no reason to believe me, Miss Marple, and you shouldn't. I've spent years wrapping myself in deceit. The respectable lord, the faithful trustee, the man who shakes hands at every charity ball. I've worn so many masks I don't even remember what my face looks like without them." He sighed deeply, and his next words were soft, almost inaudible. "But I'm tired of hiding. You may not believe me now, but I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Agatha tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes searching his. "Make this right," she echoed, her voice measured. "And how, Lord Blackwood, do you propose to do that?" "Whatever you ask," he said, his tone still raw but now tinged with a quiet resolve. "I'll hand over everything. The documents, the accounts, the names of the others. I won't protect them any more. I'll testify if I must." "And Fletcher?" Agatha asked softly. "I'll help clear his name. He's innocent, I see that now. He doesn't deserve to carry the weight of my sins. None of them do." Rain fell in earnest now, soaking into the fabric of his overcoat, trickling down the bridge of his nose. The alley, which had seemed suffocating just moments ago, felt different. The air shifted, not lighter exactly, but less oppressive. Blackwood stood there, dripping, exhausted and waiting, a man who had crafted lies for so long that the truth, though painful, now seemed like a balm. Agatha regarded him a moment longer, her expression unreadable. "Words are one thing," she said at last. "Actions, Lord Blackwood, are quite another." He nodded once, accepting the quiet judgment. "You have my word. You will have the actions soon enough." For the first time since they had met that evening, Agatha's features softened. A faint smile, not of approval, but perhaps of cautious hope, flickered across her lips. "Very well," she said, turning slightly, her hand adjusting the brim of her hat against the rain. "Let's begin." Chapter 4. The Final Reckoning. The Old Bailey's grandeur, austere and unyielding, seemed both a comfort and a threat to those who entered its walls. On this particular morning, however, the heavy wooden doors had opened to an audience more charged than usual. The gallery hummed with tension, the murmur of anticipation rising and falling like a tide. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, scattering fragments of colour across polished wood and sombre stone, as though illuminating the room's darkest corners. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that today's proceedings would either vindicate an innocent man or confirm his guilt beyond recall. Agatha Marple, seated at the edge of the gallery, appeared unmoved by the ripples of unease around her. With her hands folded neatly in her lap and her expression calm, she might have been a casual observer at a Sunday recital. Only her eyes betrayed the meticulous attention she paid to every detail, the nervous flutter of a barrister's hand, the uneasy glance exchanged between the prosecutor and his assistant, the set of the judge's jaw. Everything and everyone had its place in her mind's careful arrangement. Behind her, a reporter whispered to his colleague, "This Beck fellow. He's to take the stand again. Says he remembers it all now." "Convenient," the colleague murmured back, but his pen hovered eagerly over his notepad nonetheless. Agatha remained still, the faintest smile playing on her lips. Convenient or not, Arthur Beck's testimony would be the linchpin. The truth was a stubborn thing, she had always believed. It could be buried beneath layers of deceit, but once glimpsed, it had a way of asserting itself. The courtroom was no exception to this rule, and she had no doubt that today, amid the prismatic light and the cloying air, the truth would finally surface. When Beck took the stand, the transformation was almost startling. Gone was the hesitant man who had previously faltered under questioning. Today he carried himself with the measured dignity of someone who had weighed the burden of silence and chosen at last to speak. His voice, though not loud, was steady and deliberate, each word clear enough to slice through the ambient rustle of notes and whispers. He faced the courtroom with unflinching resolve, his hands resting calmly on the witness box as though grounding him to the moment. "I saw Lord Rupert Blackwood that night," Beck began, his voice neither rushed nor hesitant. "I saw him in the corridor near Sir Edmund's study. He wasn't supposed to be there. It was late, and most of the household was abed. But he moved quickly, and he seemed certain." The prosecutor stirred, but Beck pressed on. "I remember it clearly now. He had something in his hand. An envelope. He slid it into Henry Fletcher's belongings. I didn't think much of it then, but when I heard about the documents found on Fletcher, it all came back to me. That letter, that night, it was no accident. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's gavel brought quiet, but the tension remained palpable. Beck's testimony was undoing the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. His voice never wavered, even as he recounted the days of confusion and fear that had followed. "I didn't speak up because I wasn't sure," he admitted, his gaze steady and direct. "I couldn't trust my own mind, but now I can. I saw what I saw, and I know it was Lord Blackwood who planted that letter to frame Henry Fletcher." The barristers exchanged glances, their polished confidence visibly cracking. Beck's calm certainty was more damning than any dramatic outburst. It left no room for doubt, only the uncomfortable realization that they had been pursuing the wrong man all along. From her seat, Agatha watched as the threads unraveled, the red herring of Fletcher's guilt, the alibis, the documents. All of it was now being exposed as a web spun by Blackwood to conceal his own crime. She saw the prosecutor's grip tighten on his papers, the judge's brow furrow as he made a note. The puzzle pieces she had so carefully assembled in her mind had finally clicked into place, and now the picture was clear to everyone in the room. As Beck stepped down from the stand, his testimony lingering in the charged air, Agatha allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, she thought, was often slow to arrive, but once it appeared, it swept everything before it. The courtroom, already brimming with tension, grew heavier as Agatha Marple stepped forward. In her hands was a dossier bound in plain brown leather, unremarkable to look at, but humming with the weight of its contents. She laid it on the table with care, and the room seemed to lean forward as one. The prosecutor adjusted his glasses. The judge paused in his note-taking. Even the reporter, pen poised, forgot for a moment to scribble. Agatha, who had so often been dismissed as merely a quiet observer, spoke with a clarity that sliced through the lingering whispers. "Contained within this dossier," she began, "are documents that shed light on the events leading to Sir Edmund's death. They have been gathered over weeks of careful inquiry. I trust the court will find them illuminating." She stepped aside as the evidence was handed up for review. A hush settled over the room as the judge examined the papers. His expression shifted from detached curiosity to sharp interest, his eyes narrowing as he read. The defense counsel rose next, holding up a letter for the court to see. "This letter," he began, his voice steady, "is one of many exchanged between Lord Blackwood and certain business associates. On the surface it seems innocuous, just a note about a routine financial matter. But when cross-referenced with bank records also provided here, it becomes clear that these were not routine transactions at all. Rather, they were part of a deliberate effort to conceal the diversion of funds from a charitable trust. Funds meant for Sir Edmund's pet project." The murmurs began, soft at first, then rising into a low rumble of astonishment. Agatha remained still, her hands clasped before her, her expression calm and expectant. She had long known that truth, once exposed, could not be contained. It had a way of spreading rapidly, like water finding the weakest cracks. But it was not just the letters and records that turned the tide. The court called Lady Evelyn Carlyle to the stand. Her entrance was unhurried, her expression unreadable. She wore a dark dress of simple elegance, her veiled hat perched at just the right angle to convey mourning without ostentation. As she took her seat, the room quieted once more, and she began to speak in a voice that was both measured and resolute. "I did not want to believe what I saw," Lady Evelyn began. "But the truth is that Sir Edmund, my cousin, had uncovered serious misconduct. Lord Blackwood, among others, feared exposure. I remember the conversations, the pressure placed upon him to destroy the evidence. He refused." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "Shortly before his death, Sir Edmund confided in me. He told me he was ready to present his findings. Letters, financial statements, names. That night I saw Lord Blackwood at the house. He was not there as a guest, nor was he invited. He was there to silence Sir Edmund once and for all. Her words, clear and deliberate, struck the courtroom like hammer blows. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor rose to object, but Lady Evelyn calmly held up her hand. "The documents Miss Marple provided," she continued, "match exactly what Sir Edmund described to me. They prove that Lord Blackwood orchestrated this entire affair, framing an innocent man to protect his own position." By the time Lady Evelyn stepped down, the gallery was buzzing with outrage. The judge's gavel sounded sharply. "Order in the court," he demanded, though the command did little to quell the murmurs. Agatha, watching from her place in the gallery, allowed herself a faint smile. The carefully constructed facade of innocence was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The lies, the red herrings, the obfuscations. One by one they fell away, leaving behind the stark, undeniable truth. Lord Blackwood, a man who had wielded power and privilege with such confidence, now sat rigid and pale, his gaze fixed firmly on the desk in front of him. He did not look at Agatha. She suspected he could not bear to. And so, as the courtroom slowly regained its composure, it was clear to all present that the true culprit was not the downtrodden railway worker Henry Fletcher. It was a man of high society, one who had counted on wealth and status to shield him from scrutiny. But no shield, Agatha knew, could stand forever against the steady march of truth. Lord Rupert Blackwood rose to his feet with the deliberate slowness of a man carrying an unbearable weight. The courtroom stilled. Even the faint shuffle of papers ceased as every gaze, every breath turned toward him. For weeks the trial had been a storm of accusations, counter-accusations, and carefully crafted denials, but now, in this moment, Blackwood's expression revealed the truth. The fight was over, the mask had slipped, and all that remained was the naked reality of his guilt. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, but laced with a rawness that betrayed his internal struggle. "It is not easy to admit when one has strayed so far from the path of integrity," he began, "but it is time, long overdue, that I speak plainly." He drew a deep breath, steadying himself, and continued, "I have betrayed not only my honour, but the very principles I once held dear. I have manipulated evidence, planted falsehoods, and sought to cast suspicion on an innocent man, Henry Fletcher, when it was I who feared the light of scrutiny." A collective intake of breath swept the gallery, and the murmurs began, soft at first, then louder. The judge rapped his gavel, restoring order, but the charged atmosphere remained. Agatha Marple, seated at the edge of the gallery, watched intently, her expression calm, her eyes keenly alert. She had long suspected that Blackwood would break. Few men could carry the weight of such duplicity indefinitely, and here it was, the long-anticipated moment of truth. Blackwood's voice faltered, then found its footing again. Sir Edmund Carlyle was a man of great principle, but also one who possessed knowledge that could ruin lives, my own among them. My actions were not born of malice alone, but of fear, and yet fear, as I now understand, is no justification for what I have done. His gaze swept the room, lingering on no one person, but meeting the crowd as a whole. "I confess fully to my crimes," he declared. "I ask no forgiveness, only that justice be done." The silence that followed Blackwood's words was heavier than any gavel strike. All eyes turned to Henry Fletcher, who sat hunched and pale at the defence table. A man of modest means, thrust into a world of lies and power struggles, he had borne the weight of this trial with quiet dignity. Now, as Blackwood's confession reverberated through the room, the chains of suspicion seemed to loosen around him. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "In light of Lord Blackwood's confession, and the corroborating evidence provided, it is clear that Mr. Fletcher is innocent of the charges brought against him. I hereby order his immediate release." A collective sigh rippled through the courtroom, an exhalation of relief and disbelief. Fletcher blinked rapidly, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. He had long since resigned himself to a fate not of his making, and now, in an instant, that fate had shifted. His lawyer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and Fletcher nodded. the gesture both a thank you and a simple acknowledgment that the nightmare was over. In the gallery, Agatha observed the scene with her usual composure, though her sharp eyes softened for a moment. Justice, she had always maintained, was more than a verdict. It was a restoration of balance, a righting of wrongs. And as Henry Fletcher stood to be escorted out, not as a criminal but as a man exonerated, Agatha allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The web of lies had unravelled, the innocent man vindicated, and the true culprit had faced his reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Blackwood, for all his confession, remained a figure of tragedy, a man who had tried to protect a crumbling facade and paid the ultimate price. Fletcher, though free, carried the scars of his ordeal. The gallery began to disperse, whispers trailing in their wake, but Agatha lingered a moment longer. She observed Blackwood as he was led away, his head bowed, his shoulders stooped, and saw not just a fallen nobleman, but a man beginning a difficult journey toward redemption. As the heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut, the rain outside had stopped. The city's bustle resumed, but inside the atmosphere remained, bitter-sweet, complex, and undeniably human. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. Chapter 5. Redemption and Renewal. The embankment stretched quiet and empty, save for the faint hum of the city stirring awake. The pale light of dawn rippled across the Thames, turning the water to liquid gold. Henry Fletcher walked with deliberate slowness, each step deliberate, as if he were testing the ground after years of instability. His broad shoulders, so often hunched under the burden of suspicion, were now square. The faintest hint of a smile played on his lips as he gazed out at the river's steady flow. Behind him, a pair of familiar voices called out. He turned, his smile widening as his family hurried to catch up. His wife, her arm linked through their son's, gave him a look that was part pride, part relief. "Henry," she said simply, the warmth in her voice enough to tell him what words could not. Their son reached out, grasping his father's hand, as if to reassure himself that Henry was really there, free and unshackled. The three of them continued down the path, their quiet laughter breaking the stillness of the morning. Passers-by nodded politely, a few even offering tentative smiles, as if the air around Henry had changed, no longer charged with the tension of accusation, but instead carrying a quiet dignity. Together, they walked toward a future no longer defined by shadowed whispers or doubt. Across the city, the light of dawn spilled into Agatha Marple's modest office, the familiar scent of brewing tea mixed with the faint tang of ink and paper. She sat by the window, her small hands curled around a steaming cup. The streets below bustled faintly, a baker unlocking his shop door, a delivery boy pedalling his bike past a milk cart. To most it was an ordinary morning. To Agatha it was a moment of calm, in which she could untangle her thoughts. Her eyes settled on the window-pane, where droplets from last night's rain still clung, catching the light. The case, now concluded, lingered in her mind like a book's final chapter that refuses to close. She replayed each moment, Blackwood's unmasking, the red herrings, the conflicting loyalties that had driven each character's actions, the clues, so small and seemingly inconsequential at first, had grown into a damning picture that could not be ignored. She took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her, and allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The truth, as always, had been obscured by human frailty. Greed and fear, so often the culprits, had distorted loyalties and eroded principles. But she also saw courage in the choices that had been made, the courage of a man like Fletcher to endure injustice, the courage of a woman like Evelyn to come forward, and even the courage of Blackwood to face his misdeeds in the end. Agatha set down her cup and glanced at her desk, where her neatly organized notes lay. The city's hum grew louder now, the day officially beginning. Her work, as it often did, had revealed not only the perpetrator of a crime, but the delicate balance of morality that surrounded it. Truth, she reflected, was never a single, shining beacon. It was a fragile thing, built piece by piece, a puzzle completed only with persistence, patience, and compassion. As she rose and prepared to face the day, Agatha Marple allowed herself one last thought. Perhaps no victory could undo the harm that had been done, but each step toward justice brought its own form of renewal. In that quiet realization she found a small but enduring sense of peace. In the dim light of the prison cell the scratch of a pen echoed faintly. Lord Rupert Blackwood sat hunched over a wooden writing desk, the single candle before him burning low. The air was damp, the stone walls cold and unyielding. Gone were the fine suits and polished shoes. The man who once strode confidently through London's elite salons now wore the coarse uniform of the condemned. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his thoughts, but his hand moved steadily, the ink flowing as he committed his final words to paper. The letter began not with a plea for forgiveness, but with an acknowledgment of his fall. "I have no illusions," he wrote. "I betrayed the trust placed in me, and I must bear the consequences. But as I reflect on my life, its moments of pride, its failures, its cowardice, I find a singular truth. It is never too late to choose the difficult path, the right path, even if one walks it only briefly." He paused, the pen hovering above the paper, then continued. "But what I have done cannot be undone. My actions caused harm to those who deserved better, and my name shall forever carry the weight of shame. But perhaps, there is a chance for some small redemption. I intend to devote the days I have left, however few they may be, to unearthing the wrongs I ignored, to speaking the truths I once buried. My hope is that by doing so I might prove to myself that the man I became is not all that I am." The letter grew in length as the night wore on, each word a fragment of the soul he sought to reclaim. When at last he finished, Blackwood leaned back, his face gaunt and lined, but not without a trace of peace. He left the letter folded neatly upon the desk, the wax seal stamped with his family crest. It would find its way to those he had wronged, and perhaps one day, when the wounds were no longer raw, they would read it and see not only a villain, but a man who had tried too late perhaps, but earnestly, to atone. The morning air was sharp and bracing as Agatha Marple stepped onto the street. The city stretched before her, a patchwork of stone and brick that carried on, indifferent to the individual lives that played out within it. The muffled clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the soft rustle of newspapers being folded on street corners, the faint whistle of a baker's boy, all seemed to blend into a symphony of London awakening. Henry Fletcher's honour had been restored. Blackwood's name, though tarnished, had gained a certain dignity in his admission of guilt. And for Agatha, the case now settled, there remained the faintest hint of satisfaction. Not the triumphant kind, justice was rarely so neat, but the quiet, enduring sort. She walked without haste, her thoughts wandering, as they often did once the dust had settled. The truth, she reflected, had a curious way of revealing itself in layers, each one peeling back to show something more complex, more human. The city around her was a labyrinth of mysteries yet to be uncovered. She glanced briefly at a newsstand where the morning papers heralded the resolution of the trial. Beyond that headline, she knew, lay countless other stories, some already unfolding, others waiting in the shadows. Her work was never truly done, nor would she want it to be. There was a comfort in knowing that no matter how deeply buried, the truth always found its way to the surface. As Agatha turned a corner and made her way toward her office, the brisk wind tugged at her coat. She clutched it closer, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Each case she took on left a mark, not only on the lives involved, but on her own sense of purpose. And as the city hummed around her, she knew she would continue to follow those faint trails of evidence, those whispers of deceit, until her work was done. The truth had a light of its own, and she would walk in it as long as she could. Epilogue. The fog that had shrouded London's streets for days finally began to lift, unveiling a city cautiously stirring into a brighter future. The trial, with all its drama and revelation, had left an indelible mark, not just in the headlines, but in the minds of those who had watched it unfold. It was a story that would be told in hushed voices and excited whispers for years to come, a reminder that even the most intricate web of lies could be unraveled with patience, persistence, and an unflinching commitment to the truth. Henry Fletcher, once a man crushed beneath the weight of false accusations, had found himself unexpectedly lauded as a symbol of resilience. Though he remained the same quiet, unassuming figure, his reputation had been restored, and his name became a watchword for the common man's ability to weather storms of injustice. Children skipped over cobblestones, singing rhymes about Fletcher the Freed, and in the working-class pubs of Southwark and Bermondsey he was spoken of with a kind of awed respect. For Lord Blackwood, the end of the trial marked a far darker turn. Stripped of his influence, his standing among the elite reduced to whispers of scandal, he was left to confront the choices that had brought him so low. Those who had once shaken his hand now avoided his gaze. Yet, in his retreat from society's glare, there were murmurs that he had begun quietly working to repair what he had broken. Anonymous donations to those wronged by his schemes, whispered apologies delivered through intermediaries. Redemption, if it ever came, would be a long, solitary road. And then there was Agatha Marple. She walked through the city as she always had, her step steady, her gaze observant. In the aftermath of the trial she made no great speeches and accepted no laurels. Those who had come to know her efforts understood she did not seek recognition. Her satisfaction lay in the simple act of righting wrongs. In peeling back the layers, she moved quietly through the shifting crowds, her presence so unobtrusive that she often seemed part of the city itself, a quiet guardian whose sharp mind and patient heart had proven that justice, no matter how delayed, could still prevail. As she crossed London Bridge one clear morning, the sun broke through the last tendrils of mist, scattering warm light over the Thames. The water sparkled with a clarity that mirrored the mood of the city. A faint smile touched her lips, though no one was near to see it. Agatha Marple knew there would be other mysteries, other cases to puzzle out. But for now, London was a city reborn, its streets no longer heavy with doubt, its people daring to believe once more in the power of truth.